Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. It's Friday, June 27th, 2025, episode 423. Who's listening? Well, yesterday, I had no episode because I was in arbitration all day, came home emotionally and physically exhausted. So my testimony is done, and now lawyers on both sides will be submitting briefs, which are basically written closing arguments. And then the arbitrator has a month to make his decision. And then they get together once again to see how much, if I get anything. Um, it was an interesting day. I forgot my hearing aids, and everyone was whispering that day. I tried to listen really hard. So at one point in the hearing, I was cupping my ear and I put my head down and closed my eyes because I was trying so hard to figure out what everyone was saying, but it looked like I was sleeping. So my lawyer had kicked me and said that the other lawyer, the opposition lawyer, was trying to get the arbitrator to see that I was sleeping, which of course I wasn't. I mean, I just couldn't hear anything. But a couple of interesting things came out. What seemed to be a good day for me. I don't know these things, but it seemed to go well. Um, a university's lawyer found this podcast. Yes, the Subjective Professor's podcast. And they were about to play an episode to impeach my testimony, or basically to show that I was lying. And it's an interesting use of words. So in arbitration, in any kind of court legal setting, words have to be precise. And I've said that, but at the same time, I also talk about the subjectivity of words as well. But what means one thing in one situation and then flipping it to see a different subjectivity, it doesn't fly, right? So in other words, when you state a subjective perspective, even if it's just one of many interpretations of what just happened, the one you state is the one you're basically saying you believe, or that is the very reason why you're doing that. So, as you know, um, in a podcast situation, there is some latitude because it's over time. You can explain what you were actually saying, but for people to listen to what you have to say, you have to embellish a little bit, maybe emphasize a subjective take on a subject, on a concept, sort of like the idea of students dropping a class. And and I was trying to explain in episode 182 that uh, a lot of students drop my class because they don't like what I have to say. So instead of them signing up for the class, making their schedule, getting their schedule in the way that they like, I decided that I was going to try to save people a lot of effort and help them to make the decision before the semester even starts. And so I would front load my methodology, and people who weren't down with that, they could just find another another instructor who would be more to their liking. And I engage in a little bit of hyperbole, right? Because it's funnier to say it one way than to say it in another. But really, it was me trying to get students who were not interested in learning, were not interested in broadening their subjectivity, to realize that this is really not going to like the class. Um, but anyway, it was going to be portrayed as in a way that would show that I was lying earlier in my testimony when I said that no, I didn't deliberately try to get students who would complain to drop the class, because how would you know who would actually complain? Now, it was my anecdotal sense or my sense that a student who would be confronted with all this, um, you know, postmodernist deconstruction type stuff, that they would drop the class. But as it turns out, I found out later that it didn't necessarily work that way, that there are some students who I talked to later who said, "Oh, I wish I stayed in the class because I really would have enjoyed it." So, but you can't take that into consideration. What's said is said. And so that's what is going to be used against you. And I thought that was, it gave me an idea for this episode. Now, thankfully, that particular episode was not admitted as evidence. I think that's what was said, that it wasn't admitted as evidence because of relevance, right? I made that episode 182, I think, came over a year after my contract expired. And so, can you say that it is directly relevant to the case? And I think that's what the argument was that was made. Um, and another note is the hypocrisy of that kind of um, line of attack is because they're upset. They're going to use it to show that I tried to get unmotivated students to drop the class, but they're happy, right? The university is more than happy to force students to learn material which goes against everything that the students believe without allowing students the ability to push back, right? And so it's this weird hypocritical situation, but it doesn't matter because rules are rules, right? And that's part of what I'm going to be talking about today is the use and purpose of rules, right? There's the intent of rules, but then there's the actual use and purpose of those rules. But the point that really makes me sad is that it means that the number of views on my videos is not as high as I thought, since at least one person is going through uh, listening or even just downloading for a snooping algorithm, listening to all these episodes to find incriminating material, right? And so it's not that someone was actually listening to learn because they were interested, but because they were trying to dig up dirt. My wife always told me that the university probably was listening, and I thought it was kind of a joke. Although in the back of my head, it would make sense that they would look for it and that they would find it. And I knew that anyone could find it because I did that interview with the people I met at the Ron Paul Institute conference down in DC. And there, all my contact information was subjective professor. But what a world we live in that we have to worry about the content of our speech. Now, we always do have to worry about that. It's called etiquette and manners, right? Like, be careful of what you say around certain people, secrets, confidential information. Yeah, yeah, we have to worry about that. But that is more of a voluntary situation. Even as a pastor, what I say publicly and what I say in private, what I say in private could be used against me in a public situation. But see that public speech that we say, or even what we say in private, it's voluntarily private, right? It's stuff that we keep to ourselves, right? The consequences of that kind of stuff is on the table. Like, so for example, if I preach about Jesus, but then I go home and say, I don't actually believe in any of this stuff. I know that there are potential repercussions if that ever got out, if people ever found out that's what I actually believe. It's not, I'm using it as a hypothetical, so it's not what I actually believe. But if it was something that I said and believed and it got out, then I know what those consequences are, you see. And I'm okay with that. But expressing one's opinions and those opinions getting us in trouble, whereas otherwise it shouldn't, that's what I mean by we have to worry about the content of our speech, especially if we say something one way in one place and then another way in a different way somewhere else, put side to side, if you didn't really understand what I was saying, you could portray them as example of lying, right? Which one was the lie? So after finishing my testimony, I felt dirty, violated in some way, right? Like, sure, I do a podcast and I put a lot of personal information in these podcasts, right? That's kind of the downside of being a teacher or someone who does public type talking. But the chances are that the people who are listening have no idea who I am. Maybe they have some sense of my character, but otherwise, this is a one-way street, right? So I talk into a microphone, some people listen to it, and they're listening to the ideas, right? And so the person delivering the ideas is less important than the content of what I'm delivering. But to change that, tweak that, and say that someone is listening to find dirt, right? So they don't care about the content, only what they can use to get me in trouble or what they can use and portray in a certain manner to get me in trouble. So they're not interested in actually what I'm trying to say, what I'm trying to achieve. They just want to get me in hot water. So I was in that narrow kind of situation, but imagine there being many things which you could get in trouble. And I'm not talking about in a hearing court situation, but in terms of criminal activity, right? That what you just did can be labeled as criminal, and therefore now you have the possibility of facing fines, right? Monetary fines or prison time, right? So a couple of examples is like anti-Semitism is a big deal these days, right? And I've called it the new racism, right? Where people would cry racism all the time to shut down an argument. Well, now it's labeling someone as an anti-Semite, right? So people don't talk about racist anymore. They talk about being anti-Semitic. And that actually came up, right? The question that I received yesterday was, do you know that people call you a racist? And I was like, well, yeah, right? Well, but I was waiting for the follow-up question, but there was none, and that was not really um, brought up, right? Uh, like, what do they mean by you're a racist, right? And for me, it's as if you've been listening to this episode, you know it's not a big deal, right? Who's not a racist? That's actually the big question because we all are, right? And so to call someone a racist is nothing. It means nothing since all of us are discriminatory in some way. But of course, in a legal situation like an arbitration hearing, if you just say it and you leave it like that, then people walk away with, of course, the pejorative or the negative understanding of what that expression means. All right. So hopefully, when I acknowledge it very casually, that it would mean something, right? That it would telegraph that obviously there's something more here, but it's not relevant. So this is an example of how what people say will be misconstrued, it will be misrepresented. Um, But there's the thing, that's pretty much what happens every day in society, is it not? People get upset and offended by what they heard based on their subjective understanding of what those words mean. But there's no curiosity, there's no interest in trying to figure out what the person meant by what they said. And after getting it wrong numerous times, I would, whenever something like that would happen, I would always ask the person what they mean by what they just said. And then you realize that you got it wrong. They misused a word, they didn't understand what they were saying, and you clear up the matter, and it's not a big deal. Um, but also imagine that there are many rules in place that creative and innovative ideas are labeled as criminal ideas or illegal in violation of some vague policy written for simply the appearance of safety or caring or quality. And that is what I call authoritarianism, right? Where you have all of these arbitrary rules uh, meant to control people's behavior. And they're sold to us as, an effort to make something safe, to make something, to show people that the people in charge care about you, right? But really, all it is control. Authoritarianism expressed through arbitrary rules. And those rules become opportunity to or criminalize people, or those rules become the basis for accusation later. I've talked about this before, but East Germany before the fall of the Iron Curtain, and the Iron Curtain is that hard line between the free world and the communist world, right, in Europe. So you got East Germany, Romania, Bulgaria, you know, these countries which are in a line that were under the control of the Soviet Union. They were the Iron Curtain. And so behind the Iron Curtain was a lack of freedom and a lot of authoritarianism. So East Germany, which was on the other side of the Iron Curtain, um, one in every four people was an informant for the secret police. One in every four. That means people in your own family were watching you, not because they cared, not because they loved you, but because they want to narc on you. They want to inform the police about what you just said, about what you did, so then they would come and arrest you, right? So people narking on their own family members. So you could not even speak freely in your own home. There was a movie, Equilibrium, which was a dystopian movie with Christian Bale. Most people probably watched it for the gun fu, right? Not kung fu, but gun fu. They would do kung fu except with guns, extending the range of your punch, basically. Um, but it was a society where everyone narcs on each other. And so everyone had to perform or pretend or act that one was complying with all the rules. Otherwise, your own children would narc on you. North Korea is like that, right? A lot of liberal scholars, a lot of university scholars complain about performative culture, right? Where people are just simply going through the motions for social credit scores or social street cred. But that's kind of harmless in the sense that it's voluntary. You do it, and if you want to follow someone else's whatever, that's voluntary. But when in an authoritarian society, stepping out of line, doing something that is not prescribed or intended means imprisonment or death. And so I always say that laws and regulations do not change behavior. They only create criminals, right? And so you have all these rules in place, like, oh, you got to do it this way, you got to do it that way. People don't follow those rules if they know they won't get caught, right? They follow the rules because they know that they will get caught and it would mean prison or fines, right? But it doesn't actually change what people believe. So people who are going to do drugs are going to do their drugs. People who go to another state to buy something that doesn't have tax on it, right? They're going to do it, right? So you don't change people's behavior by passing rules and regulations. And maybe that's what upsets so many people in the university about me, was that for the most part, and believe me, I'm not that creative, but I always have a problem with doing things in the way that I'm told to do, right? Because this is the only way, this is the best way. And I always had a problem with that kind of, you know, prescription compliance type structure. And so I always put my own spin on things, which I think is a natural human behavior. And I think most professors are like that. But if you did it in a way that pleased the people in charge, then you never got in trouble. But if you did it in a way where you undermined the legitimacy and the authority of those people in power, then you're a problem that they want to get rid of. I don't know, maybe that's what upsets certain people, that they would continually come at me all the time. Maybe they just don't like people or professors who taught students how to think and make conclusions and make choices which do not fit their narrow view of what is right, right? And so they wanted a standardized education with a standardized way of teaching so that everyone arrives at the same conclusions, and I've talked about this in the context of innovation when we would have pitch projects and stuff like that, pitch competitions. And all the other classes would continually come up with the same old ideas semester after semester because they were given the answer as they were given the assignment. Whereas for me, I taught free thinking. And so then we had crazy ideas, variety of ideas. And so, I always seem to, people have called me contrarian. I don't just see it that way. I just don't like following the crowd. I always find something different to do, to do something in a different way, hopefully in a better way. Um, and that is just simply unacceptable in an authoritarian society. In other words, freedom is evil in a society which has lots of rules. Uh, Remember, government, which is the source of all of these rules, it's never the solution. They can never come up with a good solution. Good solutions come through people living in freedom, right? People living free, realizing that they have all the responsibility uh, of the choices that they make, are always trying to find ways to improve their choices and the life that they live. So they're trying to police the rules that they have imposed on us, and I'm always trying to figure out how to make them better. So stay free, and I will talk to you next time.